dessert is one of my absolute favorites. It's super decadent, rich. Honestly, you'll be very surprised when you taste it. And if you're the one cooking it, you know what ingredients are in there, because no one else will suspect that there's any sort of healthful benefit to this at all, which is really what we aim for with a lot of desserts. And so the first thing we need to do is start the crust. The crust is made up really simply of 3 ingredients. So we have dates for sweetness, we have walnuts for a lot of the body of the crust, and it gives us some healthy fats, fiber, and protein, and then some really good Dutch cocoa powder for a nice rich chocolate flavor. I recommend Dutch cocoa powder, which you might notice is this really deep, rich, beautiful dark brown. It's going to have less of a starchy flavor than the just standard cocoa powder that doesn't have processing with alkali. It'll be a lighter brown color. It will still work, but it's just, this is a much richer chocolate flavor. So the first thing we need to do is soften up these dates. There's no need to buy the really expensive medjool dates, which are really moist and sumptuous, and you can just, just bite right in. Those are used raw in a lot of desserts, and this will still technically be raw, but these are noir dates, so these are, less expensive. They're pitted to make your life easier. Just buy them with the pits already removed, but they're a little firmer, so they're going to be a little bit hard to process in our food processor without softening them a bit with some boiling water. If you do buy the more expensive medjool dates, you can probably skip this step or just soak them very briefly, but I'm going to pour some hot to boiling water over for about 10 minutes. Just make sure they're mostly submerged. And then we'll drain that water off really well before we actually go to process this. So while we do this, we'll move on to working on the filling. So we'll just go back and forth to make good use of our time. The most important part here is getting the chocolate melted properly, and I'll explain that in a second, but first I will go over the other ingredients. So for our chocolate, we have a 70% or greater cocoa content, and when you're looking at cocoa contents, just a reminder that whatever the percentage is how much of the solid cocoa that is in there from the actual cacao bean, and then the remainder is usually sugar. So if it's 70% cocoa or cacao, then it's about 30% sugar. So the higher the content, then the healthier that is. The amount of sweetener, which is really minimal, that we're using just to kind of take a little bit of the bitterness off of the chocolate, is maple syrup. If you use a higher percentage cocoa, you might need to use a little bit more sweetener to balance it, or add more sweeter fruit as a topping compared to what we'll do in the finished product. But so I have the maple syrup, as I mentioned, and then also we'll use a little pinch of salt, not the amount shown here, and then a couple teaspoons of vanilla. And then what makes up, besides the chocolate, what makes up most of the body of the filling is this silken tofu. So this kind is actually shelf stable. There are 2 different varieties. There's a shelf stable kind and the kind that's refrigerated. But the most important part is the texture. So if you feel it with your finger, it's just really smooth and silky. It's not lumpy or bumpy like the tofu that we typically use for baking or roasting. And if you stick your finger in it, mush it up, rub it between your fingers, then it might not be everyone's favorite texture like this, but it will be totally smooth. There won't be any grit. So if you get regular tofu that you would be roasting and you get the gritty kind, they really cannot be substituted for each other. So you just have to wait until you have the right type of tofu to do this. The nice thing about the silken tofu is you can also use it in smoothies, really anywhere you would want a creamy texture without adding a lot of flavor. So it doesn't really have much taste. It will take on the flavor of whatever else you're putting into your recipe. I'm going to melt the chocolate. So there's a couple ways that you can melt chocolate. A lot of recipes will say put it over a double boiler. I'm not going to do that today. I'll show you the way that most people will probably do it at home. What a double boiler is it's having on a burner on your stove a pot of water, and then you would use a metal bowl or something that's going to be safe to put on a metal pot. You want to make sure that the water is not touching the bottom of the bowl and it's just steaming, and you're going to use the heat from that steam to melt the chocolate, and you would stir it every so often to make sure to keep the temperature pretty even throughout the chocolate. We're going to do the microwave version, which I think is a lot easier, less dishes, less messy. And what you want to do is just microwave it for about 15 seconds at a time. On high is fine. Take it out and stir it. So I'll demonstrate that now. And then you repeat that as many times as you need until it's melted. You don't want to put it in there for a couple of minutes thinking you're going to save time, because what will happen is there'll be hot spots in the chocolate. that will cause the chocolate to separate. So you get the lumpy solids of the chocolate and then the oily part of the chocolate. There's no way to get those to come back together. It will be greedy, it won't taste good, and you just have to throw that chocolate away. So if you're using good quality chocolate, it ends up being an expensive mistake. So better to do the heating multiple times than it is to overheat, trying to save a little bit of time. Here I've microwaved this for about 15 seconds. You can still see that it's mostly unmelted, but there's just the hint that it's starting to melt. Sometimes it takes 5 times, sometimes 10. It really just depends on the size of your chocolate chunk. So we'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll come back when it's mostly melted so I could show you what that looks like. All right, so we're at the stage where our chocolate's pretty much melted. There are a few little solid lumps in there you can see. That's about the point where I don't heat it up anymore and I just stir and use the heat that's residual in the bowl to finish melting it. That's a good insurance against getting that, dreaded separation of your chocolate and having to throw it all out. You can always, if you stop it a little too soon, you can always add more heat. You can't take it away. And you do want to work fairly quickly at this stage, otherwise you have to reheat your chocolate if you're going to make the filling, because as soon as you add melted chocolate to something that's not very warm, it will start to firm up. And we also have to have that not be solid while we finish making our crust, which we have yet to do as well. So the first thing for our filling that we want to put in here is our tofu. So again, this is that silken tofu. And for these containers, the ones that you can get on the shelf, you just cut along the lines and then you just open it up and dump it out. Sometimes there's a little residual liquid and you want to discard that over the sink, but I already did that part, so a few extra drops, so I'll put this in. I'm also using the extra firm. That will just give it a much more nice sliceable texture. So if you can only find soft in the store, that's fine. It just might be that the filling doesn't firm up quite as much. And I'll put my other non-chocolate fillings in here as well. So I have that little bit of maple syrup for sweetness, a couple of teaspoons of vanilla extract, and then just a pinch of salt. All right, and if you're using a regular blender at home and not one of these high-speed blenders, this is really easy to blend. You do not need a fancy blender for this, so you just blend it until it's smooth, and I'll show you how to test it. Yours may just take longer than mine does if you have, a less powerful blender. So it's not quite done blending yet, but if you notice that you hear the sound in your blender change, it might mean that it's not getting down to where the blades are, so you need to stop it, take the lid off, and use a scraper. This blender has this stick where I can kind of push things back down toward the blades, which is really handy, but if you don't have that, you'll have to stop it multiple times and scrape things down or take it off and tap it on the counter like that, and that will also get the ingredients to go down to the bottom of the blender. So we're going to take a look at this here, and I'll show you how you can tell if it's done. So the easiest way is to test with your fingers, and you can use a spoon if you're not supposed to stick your fingers right in there. But so I just get a little bit on my fingers and then rub it between my fingers, and it should be totally smooth. So there shouldn't be any sandy feeling. Like if you feel like you have sand on your hands from the beach or something, that you're not quite there. But we're still going to blend a little bit with the chocolate, so I'll go ahead and add that chocolate to this in a stream. If you're using a regular blender, you do want to make sure your chocolate's still warm. It's a little bit more fussy. The higher powered blenders, they actually produce a little bit of heat. So if your chocolate's firming up, you can just run it a little bit longer. It will actually heat the chocolate up in the blender because the horsepower's so great in the blender. But again, if not, this is cooled off because you had to rush off and do something, rewarm this before you add it. Otherwise, it'll all get stuck in your blender. I'm going to turn the speed back down to low here so it doesn't spray out the top of my blender. And even with this type, you're going to have to stop and scrape down the side here. it. You can still see some of that white of the tofu along the edges of the blender. And if you're looking down, you can see it looks like a thick chocolate mousse. I'll show you a better angle here in a second. And if you weren't totally sure if you got your tofu fully blended before, you could do the same method to rub between your fingers and check again. I'm going to share a little tip here. So since we were multitasking and we still have to go back and make our crust, I'd recommend that especially if you're using a regular blender and not a high-powered blender, you take it out of the blender at this point and then put it into another bowl. Because then if it gets totally solid before you finish making your crust, you can always warm it again for about 15 seconds at a time in the microwave to loosen it up, make it so it's spreadable again, and then put it over your filling. We'll take a little pause for a second, do that, and we'll get all of our ingredients back out for our crust and work on that. So we have our dates that were soaked in the hot water. It's cooled off now while we were doing other things, so I'm just going to drain that extra water out. There are a number of recipes in the curriculum that say to make a date paste if you don't want to use processed sugars and other ingredients. If you wanted to make a date paste, you would actually do the same process but keep the water and put it in the blender and just blend it until it's smooth. You can keep that in a baggie in the freezer. It never gets hard because it has a very high natural sugar content, and you can just pull off what you need to sweeten things, whether it's, you know, sweetening baked goods or sweetening a smoothie, whatever. So that's the beginning of how you'd make date paste. We're not going to make paste per se. We're going to make it a little chunkier and make a crust. So our crust is really simple. We're just going to add our dates, try and keep the water out of there. Sometimes a little bit hides in those little nooks and crannies where the pits came out, so you have to, you know, pull them out with your hands. We'll put some walnuts, but almonds are great, pecans are great, really any kind of nut works really well in here. I do like to pre-toast my nuts for this. It gives it a lot more flavor. It takes away some of the raw taste and just gives it a richer flavor. What you do to roast is just turn your oven to 350 and then put your nuts in a single layer on a sheet pan. Cook them until they're warm. Like if you pick one up in your hand and hold it, you know, it gets too hot to hold and you have to put it down, and it's slightly more golden in color than it was when you put it in. Nuts that are burnt you have to throw away. They're not good at all. So better to under roast than to over roast. And you want them to be cooled for this, otherwise it will turn into walnut butter. And we're otherwise not going to cook this. So we'll have those two ingredients and then just the cocoa powder. I would normally sift cocoa powder like we did flour in some of the other recipes because it will tend to be clumpy. This, our food processor is going to do the breaking up of the clumps, so we don't need to do that extra step. And this does not work great in a blender. I think if you have a combo blender food processor, you can accomplish it, but you could make a date paste if you wanted to, and then pound up the walnuts to be smaller, try and squeeze out any extra liquid out of the dates, and then you could mix it together if you wanted. Otherwise, you could use a standard pie crust, or you can make a standard graham cracker crust. This is just meant to be, you know, a healthier option. If you're incorporating a lot of nuts and things into your diet, you tend to find that, you know, having some chopping equipment does tend to pay off over time, because you can avoid, you know, having to buy those things out, which are a lot more expensive, and, you know, eventually it will pay for itself. But definitely, you know, some investment at the start of cooking if you're getting all this stuff from scratch. So I'm going to pulse this. You don't want to leave it run continuously, anything with nuts, for a long time, because again, the nuts will turn into a butter, which is not what we want. We want a few little chunks, like a grainy sort of texture. And so how chopped up you get it really depends on how you like this. If you want little pieces of nuts, you know, you don't want a totally smooth dessert, then you could leave it a little chunkier. If you want it to be more uniform and just more melt in your mouth, you want to get the little pieces of walnuts really small. The other purpose of pulsing the food processor, since you see me do it a lot of times, you might be wondering why not just let it run for a little bit, is that it will help like mix it up more, so you don't have to pull the top off and scrape it down as much if you pulse rather than just let it run. So I think we're pretty much there. I'll show you. And again, this is just how I like it, but you could do it to your taste. So there we go. So you can see it's really, you know, it's almost kind of like a super rich chocolate cookie dough sort of texture. And then you could put it in an 8x8 brownie pan. You can put it in a pie tin. So I have a pie tin here. A lot of people have those. You can, if you're taking it to someone's house, you can get a disposable pan if you want, one of those foil ones. If you want to make nice pretty slices and put them on a plate, you can use the springform pan like we did before. That's the one with the little latches that you can undo to take the sides off. I'm going to use that just because I have it, but normally I actually do it in a pie pan. So. And then the other, you know, very inexpensive piece of equipment I would recommend is a little sheet of plastic wrap. It will help you to press down the crust without it sticking to your hands. Dump the crust into the pan. If you're doing this in a pie plate, I'll show you that since most people will be doing that. You actually want to press it so it goes up the sides, so it just makes it just like a pie crust. In the springform pan, I'm going to have it just be the bottom so I can have some nice layers. So at the end, we'll have the layer, a dark, dark layer of crust. We'll have a slightly lighter chocolate filling, and then we'll have a creamy coconut topping at the top. So you get 3 pretty layers if you do it in this. You can put parchment underneath, but the natural oils from the walnuts prevent it from sticking. We're not going to bake it, so the dates won't, you know, caramelize and, you know, adhere to the pan. And then I find the parchment just kind of moves around underneath of this, so it's easier just to press it straight into the pan. You can also put your hand in a Ziploc baggie and kind of, or if you have plastic gloves that don't move around, you can use a gloved hand too, but not everyone has gloves at home, so I'll do this. You know, if you do a lot of cooking with chilies, it is nice to have gloves at home to prevent, you know, getting those chilies on your hands and then rubbing your eyes later, but it's a little optional thing. Or if you don't like touching slimy, messy things, then it's also nice to have them. All right, so you can see it's really shiny. That's just, again, from the natural oils from the walnut. We didn't add any oil to this. It's definitely a much higher fiber, much, you know, no processed carbohydrate, and much healthier version of a crust than, say, a traditional pie crust, which, you know, has a lot of butter and shortening, tons of saturated fat. If you're making a lard pie crust, there's tons of cholesterol from the animal fats, and this has no cholesterol, and the only fat is the, you know, really healthy fat from the walnuts. Yeah, and you can see once it gets close, you can actually just put the plastic in your hand and smooth it around. If I try to use my hand, it will actually still stick. So it's, you know, the plastic is kind of magic doing this. It's really, see, I touched it, it stuck to my hand. I think it's because the plastic gets coated with a little layer of that walnut oil. So here we have our pie crust, really nice and smooth. We'll put our filling in here before it gets too firm. I'm just gonna keep my chocolatey hands. Again, you don't wanna let the filling sit too long. You can see it's really thick. Like I shake it, you know, it kind of jiggles almost like Jell-O, but there's no gelatin in there. And this is still slightly warm, so when this filling cools in the fridge for a couple of hours, which I recommend before topping it, it's gonna get nice and sliceable since we use that extra firm soaken tofu. If you don't have that kind, one tip I would give you, or if you just wanna make mini desserts, since this is, you know, a relatively healthy dessert, but certainly not a low-calorie one, you can use mini muffin cups and put little mini muffin liners. If you have a silicone mini muffin cup, you can actually just do them without the liners and pop them out and make little, you know, 1 or 2 bite desserts like the dessert flip and serve it with a bunch of berries or fresh fruit. It's a really great option, really pretty. And so I'm just going to use my rubber spatula here since that's what most people have. If you have some cake making equipment and you have an offset spatula, which is one that's like a flat metal spatula with an angle in it, it makes this really easy. Make it really nice and smooth. All right, the other thing you can do is you go, you know, set that on the counter. You do want to get air bubbles out, this helps. You can see a few little air bubbles in the top there. You can see those ones that came out from banging on the counter. And it doesn't have to be perfect if you're going to put the topping on it. So if you're just going to leave it, you don't want to add, you know, the additional saturated fat you would get with the coconut cream that I'll add, then you'd maybe make it nice and smooth. You could put some berries on top. We're going to use a small amount of coconut cream on top instead of dairy whipped cream. If you would prefer dairy whipped cream, you could certainly do that. But again, you just want to have a modest portion of things with those creams on top. And we'll decorate it after it's gotten a chance to cool. The crust and filling have firmed up in the fridge, So, you know, if you want to test, you could just touch it and see, you know, it's pretty firm to the touch. I leave some fingerprints, but my finger doesn't go dipping into the middle. It's okay if it's not 100% ready to serve because you'll want the topping to firm up a little bit as well. You just don't want the topping to sink down into the chocolate. You can leave it without the topping and just put some maybe chocolate shavings. You could get a sifter, sprinkle some powdered sugar, put some fresh berries on. That will avoid you having, you know, kind of the added saturated fat you're going to get with the coconut cream. I am going to demonstrate using the coconut cream because I think it's, you know, a good non-dairy alternative to whipped cream, and it's used in a lot of different desserts. So you can, what I've done here is I've had a can of coconut cream. You could also use coconut milk. Coconut cream is just going to have more of the creamy part and less of the liquidy part, which I'll demonstrate to you in a minute. It says, you know, shake well before using. You absolutely do not want to do that with this particular step. What you want to look for is, I'm looking at the ingredient list. Of course, this is upside down because it got stored in my cupboard upside down. So you want to make sure that there's no gums or binders. It's really hard to find them without, so I actually had trouble finding without at the store. So if you have gums or binders, what it does is it actually incorporates some of that liquid back into the solid fat, so it won't whip up as firm. But if you're able to find one without any gums or binders in it, then you're going to get a superior, you know, whipping. You can even get it firm enough to put in a pastry bag and make nice designs if you wanted to. So this one does have a little bit. I've used it before, so it's not too bad. And again, have the cream, so I have a little bit more to work with. You may want to have 2 cans of coconut milk if you are using that, just so you make sure you have enough whipped topping to cover your dessert. You do not want to use light coconut milk because all light coconut milk is watered down regular coconut milk, so there's just half as much fat in there as there would be the regular, which is defeating the purpose since that's the part that you want for this step. So what you want to make sure is that you have your can sitting on the shelf for a while, let the liquid and the fat separate. The fat will usually rise to the top. And then you can put it in the refrigerator at least overnight. You know, a day or 2 is better. You just want that fat to solidify. And then I've just taken the top off the can here with a can opener. And then you can usually push the fat off to the side. See, I'll do this so you can see. And then there's a liquid component. I have this bowl here I'm just going to try and pour some liquid into. That liquid won't whip up. It won't make a good whip topping, so you just want to get that out. If you wanted light coconut milk for, say, a curry or something, then that liquid that you're discarding would work great for that. When I first started cooking with coconut milk or coconut cream, there wasn't the, you know, numerous types of, you know, coconut-based plant milks in the milk section of the grocery store. You cannot use those. So those are just a little bit of coconut and mostly water. There's not any way to separate the cream out from those, so those don't work. It has to be the kind that comes in a can. All right, I think I got most of the liquid out. Again, there's not much liquid in the cream. It'd be about twice as much if you were using a can of coconut milk. So I'm gonna scoop out the cream out of there. Spatula for this job. Spoon works well too. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get out. It's pretty solid, so you can grab a spoon or poke your knife into it and pull that solid stuff out. If there's some that you feel like is less solid but not all the way liquidy, leave that behind because that's, you know, the part that's kind of a mix of the liquid and solid, and that's going to prevent this from whipping up so firm. Okay, so now all we do to make a whipped topping that's totally plant-based here is if you can do it without any added sweetener. I like to add just the tiniest bit of powdered sugar. Again, powdered sugar, it looks like a large volume, but compared to weight, compared to the granulated sugar by weight, that's a really small amount, not a lot of added sugar. I'm just putting a tiny bit of vanilla extract here as well. And if you don't have a hand mixer, you can let it warm up a little bit and whisk it by hand with a hand whisk. It's really hard at this point to whisk with a hand whisk though, so something that will break it up a little bit, like an inexpensive hand mixer will work well. If you're someone with a nice KitchenAid mixer, you can definitely put it in the stand mixer. That will work great. You can turn it off and kind of smush the bigger pieces down. I'm going to whip for a while until this gets fluffy. If you look at it closely, you can see there's like little spots in there, and those are little solid pieces of coconut fat. And I want to make sure those are all gone and it's totally creamy and smooth, and I've whipped a little air into it to make it light and fluffy like whipped cream. And tip when you're using a hand mixer, let it stop running completely before you pull it out of the bowl, and then it will just flick little bits off to the side, and you don't have to scrape the metal parts, but you also don't throw stuff all over your kitchen. Just scrape down the sides. Usually there's a little bit more of the solid that sticks to the sides, and then the middle looks pretty much ready to go. You can see that there's some little peaks there, kind of, if you watch some of the other videos where we were whipping egg whites, there's two little peaks where I pulled this out. Sometimes they'll flop over, you know, if you can get them to be stiff like that, that's really nice. Again, you're going to get a better outcome if you can find the coconut cream that doesn't have any binders. This one does have a little bit, so it'll end up being a little softer overall, but this is still going to work for our purposes. So now I'm just going to scrape that on top of our chocolate silk pie. So other ways that you could add a little bit but not use quite so much is you could, you know, cut it with just the chocolate part and put just a dollop of this on top, just like a little dollop of the whipped cream. What we're planning to do is we'll serve this like a dessert flip, so we'll cut really skinny slices and serve it with, you know, some fresh fruit, or, you know, again, a cup of coffee, or, you know, something else. It's just meant to be a few bites of this, not to have a big piece, which would be pretty high in calories. Like we were talking about with the filling, if you have an offset spatula, this is a good time to use it, you know, in the effort to not use too much fancy equipment so that you can do the same thing as I am at home. I'm just going to use a butter knife. Spread this out. Just aiming to get it in a pretty smooth layer. And then I'm going to top it with some chocolate shavings, which is, you know, topping with something really attractive is a nice way to, you know, make up for not having, you know, a tool that will make it perfectly smooth. And you can also bang this down to flatten it out a little bit too. I just want to get it to the edge so that kind of sealed the chocolate underneath this layer. Pretty good. You can make a nice swirl pattern too if you have an offset spatula. Like that, and then I'm just show you an easy way to put some shaved chocolate. So I just have a chocolate bar. So this is a 70% chocolate bar. Just take a regular vegetable peeler. It has to be sharp. If you have a narrow, skinny piece of chocolate, it works best, but you could just kind of shave all over the top. It's a really nice way to add that without too much fuss. Again, see now, when you see that, all you do is look at the little chocolate shavings. You don't look at whether or not the coconut's perfectly smooth. So, you know, if we wanted it to just be the coconut, I think it's ready to go. What I like to do is serve this with a bunch of fresh berries, or, you know, the other thing that you could do is you could take some, you know, beautiful strawberries and lay them around in a circle. The reason I'm not doing that now, though, is that if you put a bunch of berries there, then you're kind of obligated. It makes it feel like you need to slice that big of a piece. That's a very big serving of this. So I think I'll add the berries off to the side. You could also use some fresh blueberries or some fresh raspberries. And I like to just, you know, you can make a whole nother layer, just completely cover up the top, or you can, you know, put them in a decorative pattern. You know, really totally up to you. You know, use your creativity. I hope you enjoy this really delicious decadent chocolate silk pie.